Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to another show on History by Podcast. Today, I'm joined by Professor Emeritus Richard Elliott Friedman. For those that are unfamiliar with him, Richard Elliott Friedman is the Ann and J. Davis Professor of Jewish Studies Emeritus. He was a visiting fellow at Cambridge and Oxford and a senior fellow at the American Schools of Oriental Research in Jerusalem and visiting professor at the University of Haifa. He participated in the City of David Project archaeological excavations of biblical Jerusalem. He is also Katzen Professor of Jewish Civilization Emeritus of the University of California, San Diego. Dr. Friedman earned his Doctor of Theology and Master's of Theology at Harvard in Hebrew Bible and Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations, MHL at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and Bachelor's of Arts at the University of Miami. He works in Akkadian, Aramaic, Greek, Hebrew, Latin, Ugaritic, French, and German. He was an American Council of Learned Societies Fellow, was elected to membership in the Biblical Colloquium, and was president of the Biblical Colloquium West. And so welcome to History Valley Podcast, Professor Friedman.
Thank you. Thanks for having me back. So now I'm an emeritus of two universities. Is that not right?
Yeah.
Are we not clear?
Yeah.
So I'm a double emeritus. That means unemployed. That's as far as I'll attempt for humor today. Serious now.
Do you believe that Moses existed as a historical figure?
Well, we never met, but the evidence, to state it fairly, would be that it is more likely than not that Moses, yes, is historical.
Now, what kind of evidence do you think we have to show that there was a historical Moses? And the reason I ask is because, as you know, that many scholars say that there was no Moses. He didn't exist at all, not even as a man who even led a small group of people out of Egypt. So why do you think differently from the others who think that there was no such Moses?
All right, so first of all, you heard me say it much more cautiously. I said, given the evidence, it's more likely than not than there was a Moses. Anybody who just says definitively, yes, he did exist, no, he did not exist, they're all wrong. But they're by definition wrong. They don't have that kind of evidence to know that. So that's just overstating it or trying to look cool or what. I don't know what it is. I gave up trying to look cool a long time ago. I'm too old. But the evidence, first of all, in the texts themselves, Moses comes up in so many different texts from different periods by different authors, including very early ones, that if they were making him up, they were all making him up early, and they were all making up differently. They had different senses of him. Also, that there were Mushite priests in ancient Israel who would presumably mean descendants of Moses, so they perceived themselves to come from a single figure who was, the original one. So there's that. And there's the fact that some texts are very favorable to Moses and others at times can be hostile to Moses. That's usually a giveaway in historical method that something's going on. It's like the reason we think that there really was a King David is that there's a lot of people writing negative stuff back then about King David, and especially about King Solomon. So that they're historical, that gives away that somebody was mad. Somebody had a reason to go ahead and create stories about such a person. And why would you do that if nobody's out there saying no?
When do you date the historical Exodus?
I don't. In a word, I don't know. It could be any time in the 13th century BC or BCE or early 12th. But unlikely to go back to the 14th, though I guess it's possible. But everybody knows about it and is writing about it by the mid-10th century BCE. So if whatever happened had to be before that.
So when you say
Even if they're
that,
making
you
it
don't.
up, it
Mhm.
happened 600 years earlier.
So when you say that you don't know when to place it, this is you're being cautious about trying to place it in a specific century because the Torah doesn't even tell you which pharaoh it happened under. It doesn't tell you when it happened. It just says it happened at some point in the past.
Yes, there are 5 pharaohs
Mhm.
mentioned in the Torah, and not one of them is named. So, some people regard that as evidence that didn't happen because they don't name the pharaohs, and it's because they don't really have any names. But that's not a very good argument. The fact that you don't name them doesn't mean anything. I could say the president, you don't know which guy I mean. They're both going to debate, So the pharaoh.
Do you believe that the amount of people leaving Egypt in the Exodus, whenever the Exodus happened, was exaggerated?
Oh, that's not a matter of my believing it. That's something I know. That in the ancient Near East, they loved to exaggerate numbers, and when it says that King David ruled for 40 years, and then by some strange coincidence, his son King Solomon reigned for 40 years, and 40 is a typical, 10, 12, 7, 10, 12, and 40 are the typical biblical numbers. Then you have to take that cautiously. And whenever everybody lists all the battles they won, we always say in biblical scholarship and in archaeology, according to the evidence, nobody ever lost a war in the ancient Near East. Nobody ever lost a battle because it's always, we won, we killed them, we killed 1 million of them. It's just what they said. And of course, everything's completely different in the Middle East now. Now the statistics we get are, of course, they're accurate. But in those days, before they didn't have our great knowledge, they frequently exaggerated numbers. Did you get the cynicism there, or do I have to hold up a sign saying I'm being cynical?
No, I get what you mean. I get it.
Yeah, and it is characteristic of the Near East. I mean, I said it in a half-hearted way, but the fact is, it was then, and it's true now. It's part of that culture. And it's been part of the culture for thousands of years that you exaggerate numbers. The Assyrians did it, the Babylonians did it, the Israelites did it. They just did it.
Mm.
They weren't lying. It's how they told history. They wanted to say we did great. Back at the University of Georgia, we never exaggerated our football wins or losses. We always told the exact truth, exactly how they happened. But I mean, other people tend to exaggerate in this world.
Right. Yeah.
I said I wasn't going to kid around anymore, and I'm sorry.
It's fine. It's fine.
Scholarship can be deadly boring. It saves us by throwing in some humor.
What do you make of the earliest non-biblical references to Moses coming from ancient historians such as Hecataeus, who mention him without suggesting that he is an author? Like, they don't have him like writing stuff. They just mention him, they tell us some things about him, and that's it.
Well, I don't know what Hecataeus would have known about Moses, since I can't imagine what sources he could have had, and at late also. I feel more comfortable with the Israelite historians referring to Moses, somebody they've heard of and know of. And in all periods, all historians, the key thing of writing history is sources. When someday somebody wants to write about us now, this uncanny period of the recent years that we've all just been living through, how will they know it if they're writing it 100 years from now or 1,000 years from now? The only thing to do is they have to have sources. Now, they'll have a lot of sources because so much is recorded now, and they'll have this text of you and me talking right now, and they'll have presidential speeches. They'll have they'll have it all, and they'll have books and documents and artifacts from battles and things. We have much less for the ancient world, but it's still what we have is pretty good. Between archaeology and text, and using good historical method, we have some sources, and we try to reconstruct from that. If I keep going back, and it sounds like I'm pushing that one, it's because that's what I've pushed for 46 years, teaching my PhD students all this time, that the most important thing you learn in school is method. You learn, if you're going to be a historian, you have to know historical method. And above all, for historians, that means sources. And we have sources. We have a lot in the Bible itself, and we have everything we've got in archaeologically, which becomes greater every day, because just between your last talk and mine, which was less than 2 years ago, I think, archaeology made this extraordinary set of advances using cosmic rays to identify hidden caves inside Jerusalem from the biblical period. It's just uncanny what we're getting and how much we're growing all the time in information. So on the one hand, that means I can answer you better than ever before. And on the other hand, you say I also answer you always more cautiously than ever before, because we now have better sources.
What is the documentary hypothesis?
Well, the documentary hypothesis is exactly what it says. It's a hypothesis about documents that the first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah in Hebrew, were composed originally in separate documents, and those documents were put together in several different stages, and eventually became united by some brilliant editors who are, I would say, as important and as brilliant as some of the authors into creating the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. The hypothesis has many variations. Different people think it was different ones who were these authors of different source texts at different times. But the essential amount, what I've just told you up until there, that's hardly disputed by anybody, unless they have deep religious reasons for believing that no, the whole Torah was written by one person and his name was Moses. That's different. That's a matter of religious faith, and I'm not looking for that. Oh, that's ugly, that picture up there. I didn't draw that. But it's not bad. I see what it's doing. I see what someone has done there. So the earliest texts are identified. They're called by the letters J and E, and that's only because one refers to God always as God, which in Hebrew is Elohim. So there's the E. And the other text refers to God from the beginning by his name, which in the Bible is Yahweh. Elohim, is not God's name. It just means a God. It's the generic. And the E text has the idea that the name of God wasn't known until God revealed it to Moses at the burning bush. So if you look at all of Genesis, all before that, the text that we ascribe to E, they never call God Yahweh, they just call him God, Elohim. The other source doesn't have that idea that God's name was revealed at a certain time in history. This other source just always calls God by his name, Yahweh, and in fact, never in prose refers to God, as Elohim, only as Yahweh, without a single exception. And at some point, those 2 texts were merged. Instead of just putting J on one table and the E text, the other version of what happened, on another table, some brilliant editor combined them. And that, in all likelihood, happened because the J text came from Judah, which was the southern half of the country, which in those days was a separate country, the kingdom of Judah. And the E text came from Israel, which was a separate country in those days, the kingdom of Israel, and it was in the north. So if you were from Israel, you were an Israelite. If you were from Judah, you were a Jew. And those were two different things, but they were in a united political relationship. But in 722 BC, the Assyrians wiped Israel off the map. And that became the famous 10 lost tribes. And they're not really lost at all. They obviously, they were refugees to Judah and mixed in with all the others. So today, if you're a Jew, you could be descended from one of those Israelite tribes, or you could be descended from an ancient Judean, and probably a mixture. They're all marrying each other. They were related. They spoke the same language. They had roughly the same religion with some variations. So it became one. So just as the history reflected a merger of two different countries, so the text of the Bible itself reflects that merger, and that we call JE. And the person who put them together we usually call RJE, the redactor JE. We would have said editor, except we already had used up the letter E. So we made this ugly word redactor instead.
What are the issues with claiming that Moses did write the Torah? Because there are those out there that want to insist that because they have a belief and they want the historical Moses to be the author of the entire Torah. What are the problems with that?
Well, look, it's impossible. These different texts that we call these different letters, J and E and P and D and so on, they come from different periods of time, and we can tell that because they're written in different kinds of Hebrew. And the Hebrew, there's been wonderful research done now. I mean, there are great advances, again, just in your lifetime and mine, where we can now look at texts and say, well, that's 9th century BCE Hebrew, that's 5th century BCE Hebrew. There's early Hebrew and there's late Hebrew. Part of it takes place, early in Israelite history and Judean history, and reflects those two countries. Part of it is written in a much later Hebrew. So it's not possible that any one person wrote it, because they're from centuries apart. The earliest Hebrew in the Bible is the Song of the Sea, the Song of Miriam in Exodus 15. And the other earliest one is the Song of Deborah, which is in Judges 5. And those two anybody could read, anyone who knows Hebrew could look at those and see that they're in a different Hebrew from the rest of the text. And they're as different from what was written later as Shakespeare's English is from the English that you and I are speaking right now. Anybody could tell the difference. And so that can't be by one person, and that certainly can't be a person, Moses, who would have lived in a period earlier than any of those. It's just not possible.
And doesn't the end of Deuteronomy talk about Moses' death? So Moses can't obviously can't write about his own death either.
Yeah, that's a classic old argument that how would Moses have written about his own death? But I'm going to leave that alone, because I'm now at an age where I think about my own death. And I was kind of picturing the other day, fantasizing what they're going to do at my funeral and all that. So I admit that Moses certainly could have written, preemptively about his own death. It's unlikely. It certainly looks like it was written by someone else. And there have been different answers traditionally, by religious people who still believe that Moses wrote the whole Torah. So they said, well, he wrote the whole thing except the last few lines that were written by his successor Joshua, who wrote about Moses' death. Or some people gave the answer that I just gave you, that it is possible to write about your own death. Go ahead. You and I could write the story of our deaths right now. And we just be careful not to get it wrong. If I say, well, I died and it was in Saskatchewan, and then they notice, well, no, he died in Georgia, then they'll know something's wrong. But this text has it like that, and in fact says no one knows where he's buried. So they're even covered for that. But no, he didn't write it. And that last chapter of Deuteronomy, by the way, is from 3 different authors and 1 or 2 different editors. It took 5 people to give you the last chapter of Deuteronomy. So no one person did it, whether it was Moses or not.
How does one tell when, like, which part of the Torah came from which document? Like, in other words, I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of someone that's watching this and doesn't understand how the documentary hypothesis works. How does one get or deduce E, P, D, and J from reading the Torah?
Okay, and now this is very short, right? I mean, there's a famous story in Judaism. This man asks a rabbi to teach him all of the Torah while he stands on foot. And the rabbi answers, what's hateful to you, don't do to somebody else. He says, now the rest is commentary, learn it. And so I'm doing this on 1 foot. Actually, I'm sitting, but I have to give you a 1 foot answer to a tremendous question. But just quickly, people noticed in the Bible that there were these times where God is referred to just by his name, whole chapters. Like if you look at the creation story in Genesis 1, it refers to God 3 times, and every time it just says God. It never says his name. In Genesis, starting in chapter 2, verse 3, it gives a whole different creation story, and every time it's referring to God as Yahweh, not as Elohim. So, and then you can go on, and they notice this through the text. Now, this was people several hundred years ago who noticed that. It wasn't hard to see it. Now, that didn't prove a single thing, because you and I could be talking about, the King of England, and sometimes say the King, and sometimes say Charles III. I mean, it doesn't matter. You can use the name or you can use the title. But there was a second piece of evidence that came up. People noticed that there are a lot of stories that are twice in the Bible. You call them doublets. I just mentioned the creation story occurs twice in the Bible. The story of Abraham saying to a foreign king that his wife is his sister, and then it turns out she's not. That happens twice in the Bible. The story of Joseph being sold by his brother into slavery in Egypt, it happens twice in the Bible. The story of Moses hitting a rock at a place called Meribah where there's water happens once in the book of Exodus and once in the book of Numbers. We can start listening. I once totaled them up, and it's between 25 and 30 cases of these, we call them doublets, where something happens twice, but in slightly different words. Now, that too doesn't prove anything in itself, because after all, you could tell a story and then do a repeat of it or tell it in a different way. In the last years of Beethoven's life, he wasn't writing great symphonies anymore. He loved writing little variations on a theme and writing the variations, but they were all by Beethoven, and they were variations and they were all on the same theme. So a great writer of anything can do that sort of thing. But the problem here was, when you looked at all of these doublet stories and you looked at the question about the different name of when God's name was revealed, you find out that half of the doublets always refer to God by his name, Yahweh, and the other half, the parallel, the twin stories of each of those refer to God with the other term. And it's consistent through the whole thing. How consistent? I counted the number of times that the names Yahweh or Elohim, or El for God, occur in the 5 books of Moses is about 2,000. And of the 2,000, the number of times where you get the wrong name in the wrong place, where it doesn't fit with the hypothesis, is 3. For any hypothesis in any field of science, you're right, 1997 out of 2,000 times it has to be taken seriously. And so it's when these 2 different kinds of evidence came together that we said, oh, something's going on. Now, if on top of that, we then realized that all the stories that we attributed to J takes place in Judah, in the south, and all the stories that we said refer to, the name of God, not the name of God's source, those take place disproportionately in Israel. Well, now you've got historical geography as a third kind of evidence coinciding with the other 2. And then I mentioned that you now can look at Hebrew of different periods and when they're from, And you look at that, and that coincides too. So now you have 4 different kinds of evidence that are all pointing to it. Then you look at where they're cited elsewhere in the Bible. So you'll find that certain prophets will only cite J or E. Other prophets will only cite the one called P, and you can separate them. And so we're up to 5. I put into this book, it's called The Bible with Source Revealed, where I separate also, you can read the first 5 books of Moses there, the 5 books of the Torah, and they're in different colors and fonts and the screens. We used every printing device we could, that HarperCollins could come up with to show each one. And you can read each one separately. And at the beginning of that book, I listed the 7 kinds of evidence with examples of each, so that nobody has to believe this because I say so. And nobody has to reject it because they heard, well, there's a consensus of other scholars who say opposite. You can look at the evidence and see it. It's pretty clear when you read it.
Can you talk about how scholars make a mistake in understanding the different names of God in these sources? And I know you kind of talked about that just now, but sort of. But why do they argue that these different names indicate contradictions in the different names of God when they deduce these sources?
All right. Well, first, I'd say again, it's not that God has different names in the different sources. They all know God's name as Yahweh. Period, no exception. But they all have different ideas of when the name Yahweh became known. So some, like the E source, will only refer to him as Yahweh starting like after the burning bush when he reveals his name. Another one of the sources, the priestly source, is the same thing. Whereas the source that we call J, we call it that because it calls God Yahweh. J, meaning because it's Jehovah, but we pronounce it with a Y in Hebrew. That right from the beginning uses the name of God, and each is consistent. But it's true that just that doesn't prove, anything. I said that right at the beginning. Just different names or when God's name was revealed doesn't mean anything. And so if you find texts about me when I was a kid, my name was Dick. Well, for a lot of reasons, we don't use that name so much anymore. So now I go by Richard. But so if somebody would look at the text and say, oh, well, Dick texts and Richard texts are about 2 different guys by 2 different authors. But you know and I know that they're not. So God is known originally only as God, and then later reveals his name according to several of the biblical authors, not all of them. So I don't know. What's the question of any scholar who disagrees with that? As I say, we can get out of 2,000 examples, we can identify them in all but 3 cases as being in the right place at the right time.
I think you answered my question. Why do you think that there was no conquest of Canaan?
Oh, now that's not my scholarship. That's the work of my teacher, G.E. Wright, who is, the best Old Testament archaeologist of the last century, and just a variety of great archaeologists have shown that the destruction layers for the cities of ancient Israel are there, but they're not at the right time to be from Joshua. They're from much, much earlier. And it just didn't happen. The conquest of Israel. So I can say yes. The Exodus, the departure of some Israelites, that's historical. But that there were millions of them. They arrived and they destroyed all these cities and took the land. That's just not true. And you might say, from my point of view, I'm glad it's not true, because a lot of people said, the Jews are terrible. They conquered the land by taking it away from the Canaanites and genociding the Canaanites. And that never happened. It's a report in the Bible. But look, the first 2 occurrences of the name Israel on any archaeological thing, on any historical text we have outside of the Bible, are stelae by the Egyptian pharaoh Merneptah, which is 1205 BC, in which he says he completely destroyed Israel, their seed is no more. And the second outside source that mentions Israel is the Mesha stela. Mesha was the king of Moab. He's mentioned in the Bible, and he did have wars with Israel. And in the Mesha stela, which is today standing in the Louvre, you can go see it, or there are casts of it in the Harvard Semitic Museum in Cambridge, which just changed its name to the Harvard Near East Museum, and in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. So you can have three places you can go and see the original or very good casts of it. And in it, he says he destroyed Israel, their seed is no more. So the two earliest mentions of Israel say that they were completely destroyed. And then Israel's mention of itself in the book of Joshua is, oh yeah, we completely destroyed these other guys who were there. It's just something you said then. We might them, we killed them, we wiped them out, but it didn't happen. The Egyptians didn't do it, the Moabites didn't do it, and the Israelites didn't do it. They weren't lying, they were aggrandizing. Whenever I hear this, I think of, there's that line from Mark Twain. Mark Twain says, reports of my death are an exaggeration. These weren't wrong, they were exaggerations.
What do you think of Sigmund Freud's link between Moses and Akhenaten? He claims that there's a connection between the two.
Yeah, a lot of people in my field have always been very negative about Freud's book, Moses and Monotheism. I'm not. I think it's a great book. It was Freud's last book. He was dying already. He had mouth and jaw cancer. He was dying already by then. And he had said what he wanted to say about psychoanalysis. So his last few books were more about civilization and larger social matters. And then he got this one. He'd always had a fascination with Egypt. I went to his apartment in Vienna. That was amazing. I stood next to the couch, the Holy of Holies there in Freud's own apartment. And but there's a glass case in there too, where he has all these artifacts, these Egyptian artifacts that he saved. He had a fascination with that, and had a fascination with Moses. Now that's not real hard to figure out. I mean, part of the thing with Freud is everybody likes to get to psychoanalyze Freud because you're throwing it back at him. Moses was this man who comes from a community where he comes up with a completely new idea that's different from what everybody else said, and he's opposed for it his whole life, and he has to fight for it, and he lives a difficult life for it, and he has these followers who then carry it on after he dies. And Freud's hearing all of this, and this sounds familiar. It was exactly Freud's experience. So of course he identified with Moses. And he too got his start by listening to Breuer and other great people who preceded him and who taught him. And so he pictured Moses. I'm sorry to say, he was picturing Moses like his own experience of life, that Moses heard of the idea of one God from this heresy that lasted only for one pharaoh's reign in Egypt, the Pharaoh Akhenaten. And the point he made about it was, number one, is it coincidence that the first two monotheisms known on Earth both come from Egypt? That's the first thing. And he said, and when he reads all the histories, nobody was analyzing it or making that connection. And so he raised the possibility that since Akhenaten tried to create a monotheism in Egypt, and it failed because the priests more traditionally rejected his monotheism, and when he died, they got rid of it all. And that maybe, Freud said, Moses was among the followers, either in that immediate generation or sometimes soon after, who kept the religion of Akhenaten alive, and so took this group of people living in Egypt, these foreigners, these aliens, Levites, Israelites, whoever they were, and he took them with him and created a new religion. Now, the possibility of that is certainly very good and tantalizing. The negative is the dates aren't really very good for it, because Akhenaten would be much earlier than Moses, no matter how you date Moses. So that's a problem. Secondly, that after all, the key thing about the Akhenaten religion was the name of this god, Aten, and the god of Israel was not named Aten. His name was Yahweh. Now, Freud raised the possibility that the word for Lord in Hebrew is Adonai, and he said, I'm not a linguist. He was remarkably humble, because he was not famous for being humble, but he said, I'm not a linguist, I don't know, but Adonai and Aten could somehow be related. Maybe I'll leave that to the linguists to decide. Well, they did, and they're not related. I mean, Aten and Adonai are not, it doesn't work. So there were a couple of reasons to doubt it. And so the great biblical archaeologist, William Foxwell Albright, who was the teacher of all of my teachers, he was at Hopkins. And in those days, if you wanted to do a PhD in Bible or in archaeology in this country, you went to Hopkins and you worked with Albright and nowhere else. And Albright absolutely damned Freud. He said that book is ridiculous. But the funny thing is, what he said is his cavalier attitude toward the facts of history is even worse than his cavalier attitude towards the facts of the human mind and psychology. Now, that's where Albright went wrong. If he was going to criticize Freud for doing something outside of his field, then Albright himself shouldn't have criticized something about Freud's field, about which he knew absolutely nothing. So on the one hand, I admire Albright. He's my spiritual grandfather, in scholarship. On the other hand, he and others just made it impossible for anybody to take Freud seriously until the present generation, where I and a few others who work on this now, especially like William Propp, who's the greatest authority on Exodus right now, we take Freud seriously and recognize that it is possible that there is some connection between his first two monotheisms in Earth. I don't need it to be true. I don't need it to be false. I'm a scholar. I'll look at the evidence. If Moses got something from Akhenaten, great. If Moses came up with it on his own, also great.
Let's assume for the moment. I know you don't put the Exodus in any exact century, because you're agnostic on when it exactly happened. It just had to be before the 10th century BCE. If we assume that the Exodus happened, if it turned out that evidence turned up later and the Exodus happened after Pharaoh Akhenaten's day, either it happened in the same century as Akhenaten or after Akhenaten, would you say that it's possible, if we assume that's true, that Moses could have been influenced by Akhenaten's beliefs?
Yeah, depending on the dates. Or look, even if it's, let's say it's 50 or 100 years later, ideas have been known to lie dormant for a long time. They're just underground people who are keying it, right? I mean, I don't know that much about early Christianity. I always tell people I know nothing AD, but it seems to me that in those first years after Jesus died, when the Christians must have felt like, oh, we've lost him. What's going on? And they didn't know what to make, and they must have looked like great losers to everybody else. But they kept it alive in their various teachings and in Christian groups and by 300 AD they ruled the Roman Empire. So it happens that ideas take time to conquer, and this could have been one of those. I don't know. I'm open to possibilities.
Why do you think that Moses is a Levite Israelite?
Oh. Well, first of all, explicitly in the text, it identifies him as having a Levite father and a Levite mother. Second, the priests in ancient Israel known as Mushites, who are a Levite priest group, and they're Mushites, meaning I take that to be descendants of Moses. They're Levites too. My hypothesis, it's in my book, The Exodus. Should I keep holding up books? Then it looks like I'm just trying to do sales here. But my last book, my final book of scholarship, was called Exodus, was just a few years ago, and there I argue that it was only Levites who were in Egypt. And Levite, after the word Levi, that Hebrew word, prop has established or argued, it made a fair case, that means alien, an outsider, a separate person, which is exactly what they were in Egypt. And what that would mean is all of them were in Egypt and then left were a group who had this history in common of having once lived as aliens, as outsiders in Egypt, which makes sense because if you look, there are 50-something references, 52 was it references in the Torah that say you have to be kind to aliens. You have to love the alien, not just love your neighbor as yourself. It says love the alien as yourself in the same chapter, Leviticus 19. But in 52 places altogether, that these people experienced that, and then they left Egypt. It may have been in a single exodus, like one big event, the way the Bible has it. It could have been that they just gradually drifted out. People don't understand that in those days, these were open borders. People traveled between the Levant and Egypt all the time. They were coming and going the whole time for 400 years. And so this group, the Levites, were the ones who eventually came to Israel, where the Israelites were. The Israelites weren't slaves in Egypt. The Israelites were living in Israel. And these Levites show up and their relatives, and they eventually become identified as the priesthood of Israel. But that's what's interesting about it then is one group of the Levites, known as the Aaronites, descended from a man named Aaron, became the priests of Israel. And to this day, Jews who identify as descended from the ancient priests, which you can tell because disproportionately their last name will be Cohen, which was Hebrew Kohen, a priest, or their last name might be Aaron or Aronson or something like that. They disproportionately, there's been all these genetic tests on them that they have a common genetic profile, right? Whether it's the Kohen Jews of Europe or the Kohen Jews of Arab countries or of the Far East, Africa, wherever they're from, there is a commonality genetically among them, which is different from the rest of the Jews. So this got really interesting. So when I had the idea when I was writing that book, well, then maybe it was just the Levites who were the ones in Egypt. So I wondered, what's the genetic profile of the Levites? Is there something like that? So the person, the man on this is Karl Skorecki, who's a professor in Israel, in Haifa. And I had enough connections through my days at UCSD and the institute across the street from UCSD. Oh, shame on me for blocking. Anyway, they put me in touch with Skorecki, and he and I Skyped with each other. And so I looked at what he had, and he'd published some of it already by then in the journal Nature, that yes, these priests, the Kohen group, have a common genetic profile. And he said, but the Levites don't. Not only do they not have a common profile with each other, they don't have a common profile with the other priestly groups. They don't have a common profile with the rest of the Jews. They're just a disparate group. Now that fits exactly with what I'm picturing, that the Levites didn't have genetics in common. They had history in common. They just all been living in Egypt and they all left. But then after that, they didn't all have to be related to each other. Whereas the priestly group was a very limited group within them, and they stayed related, and it's passed father to son. So on the X chromosome, I know so little about this. I'm talking about where I'm completely out of my field. But since it goes only by father to son, and it's something like the male genetic material, not the female, we're still able to trace them to this day. But Levites, even though they're also father to son, you can't connect them in any way like that. So it's very strange that genetic evidence came out of nowhere. I was writing the book already when I was turned on to this and got to talk to Skorecki about it. Sometimes it just works that way in scholarship, you know.
What do you make of Moses having an Egyptian name?
Yeah, it's denied by a few, but most scholars, right, say that the name Moses is it's just a variation on, the name of the pharaoh Ramses is Ra Moses, and Tutmosis is and Ahmoses. I mean, it's the verbal half of these theophoric Egyptian names, and so that's kind of interesting, is it not, that the leader of the Israelites has an Egyptian name? And then you say, well, who else in the Bible have Egyptian names? There's Merari and Phineas and Mushi and Hur, Greek Horus, Egyptian Horus. There are all these. There's several people in the Bible of Egyptian names, and the curious name is they're all Levites. So everyone who has an Egyptian name in the Bible is a Levite, and no one who's not a Levite has an Egyptian name. So that can't be just coincidence. That must point to something. And if I'm right that it's the Levites who were the ones who were in Egypt, not the rest of the Israelites, well, then that's very important. Some people have argued against the whole Exodus thing by saying, but look, if they really were living in Egypt all those years and then they came to Israel, they should still have some Egyptian culture that they brought with them. Like Jews in America who came here from Europe or from African countries or Arab countries, they have elements of their customs that reflect where they were. And not just why I picked Jews, but we could pick, Irish who come here and retain some of their Irish identity. But the ancient Israelites did not seem to have a broad Egyptian cultural elements. So people said, well, that's an argument against the Exodus, but it's not. It's only an argument against everybody having been in the Exodus. The Levites, on the other hand, do have elements of Egyptian culture. So my student, Michael Homan of blessed memory, who then was a professor at Xavier in New Orleans, he wrote about the tabernacle in the 5 books of Moses. There's more about the tabernacle than about any other subject in the 5 books of Moses. And it was terribly important to them. And he showed how it matched the description given architecturally of the tabernacle matches the description of the battle tent of King Ramses II, the pharaoh, even as it happens at the right time and place. And at the same time he was doing that, another scholar at the University of Washington, Professor Nogel, said that the ark in the Bible and the description of how it's carried on the shoulders of the priests and these 2 sticks, and then it has the wings over it and all that, matches the barks, which are boats of the used in Egyptian religion. He said, but that's a boat, so what's it got to do with it? They were boats, but they were never put in the water. They were carried on sticks on the shoulders of the priests, and they had wings over them. And they had gold covering. It's same thing. And names, and after all, it's the Levites who have Egyptian names. In short, there's lots of Egyptian culture, but not among all the Israelites, only among the Levites. So when I wrote about this and when I used to lecture about it in the early days, I used to say, would it spoil your day if it turned out that there were Israelite slaves in Egypt and there was an Exodus, but they weren't all in it? Does that ruin the whole thing for you? I mean, it doesn't ruin it for me.
You talk about Moses and Midian and the J and P sources.
Yeah. Well, Midian, for some reason, becomes terribly important in the Bible. Moses, when you first see him in the E source, he's a shepherd in Midian. That's all you know. And it says that his wife and his father-in-law are Midianites. And then when God appears to him at the burning bush and says, look, I want you to go over to Egypt. My Israelite people are in trouble there, and I want you to go to save them. Moses says to God, why me? He's a Midianite. And in the other sources, the J source and the P source, Moses starts out in Egypt, and then he ends up in Midian. But all of them have him sooner or later there. And the mountain of God, called Sinai or Horeb or Mountain of God, it goes by different names, but they're in Midian. Midian, if you try to picture it, it's look where Israel is today, and Jordan, just to the east of it, would be like a little south of Jordan, like between Jordan and Saudi Arabia. And just at the edge of the Sinai. And why this constant focus on Midian, especially two of the sources identifying Moses' wife and father-in-law as Midianite, and the third source, which is most interesting, the priestly source, which is written by these priests descended from Aaron, and they deny the Midianite thing. They never mention that Moses' wife is Midianite. They never say that Moses was in Midian. And they say that there was a war in which Moses gives an order to kill the Midianites. And they go to war, and they genocide the Midianites in that story. And now this didn't happen, and it was written at a time where there weren't any more Midianites anyway. They were making up the history. But the Midianite League had ended long before that. But particularly in that story, it says, but the Midianite women had seduced the Israelite men and gotten them to worship a different god, Baal Peor. And so Moses is very angry because when they go out and they kill all the Midianites, they don't kill the women too. And in biblical law, it's forbidden. You can't rape or attack or kill the women. You can't do that. But Moses is angry in this story that they didn't kill the women too. So they make a decision that all the women who've ever been with a man are killed, and only virgin women are kept alive. That's a truly weird story. But the point of that story is that the person writing that story is saying Midianites are bad. Midianite women are especially bad. And it never mentions the fact, oh yeah, Moses' wife was Midianite. And when we read the Bible now, where all of these sources have been put together, you're like, oh, Moses is out there saying, oh yeah, these Midianite women are really bad. Go out and kill them. So they have to kill all the Midianite women who weren't virgins. And what did he say to his wife Zipporah when he got back to the tent tonight? Because he just killed all the Midianite women who aren't virgins, which probably means he should kill her too. The texts are so different there, but the common element is that there really must have been some Midianite connection, and two of the sources want to develop it, and one of it wants to hide it as any way they can. The last piece of that I say to you is, I often ask people, even scholars, rabbis, people who know their Bible pretty well, I say, who is Midian's father in the Bible? I mean, the ancestor of the Midianites is a man named Midian. Who is Midian's father? And almost nobody knows the answer. It's Abraham. The Midianites are the cousins of the Israelites. That wouldn't be cousins. That would be like stepbrothers, half-brothers of the Israelites. It's understood that when Abraham's wife Sarah dies, he married another woman. Her name is Keturah. And they have 6 sons together. And one of the 6 sons is Midian. So when you connect people, Israel to Midian that strongly, and then have some ancient Israelite authors who want to do everything they can to make you forget about that and not feel connected to Midian, it means they were connected to Midian. Oh, let me throw in something. The first 2 occurrences of the name Yahweh that we have outside of the Bible are both found on inscriptions in Egypt, and both of them refer to Yahweh as being a god who is worshipped in Midian. So.
Now that's the Marna Patera Stela and the Elephantine Papyri, correct?
I have to be honest, I don't remember where the 2 inscriptions were, but you can confirm it. Yeah. I thought they were both American elephants, but you can check it. Are you watching carefully? You're seeing a scholar saying, "I don't know." You don't get this a lot, so.
When do you date the various sources? When do you date J, E, D, and P? And which order were they written in chronologically?
Yeah. If I'm right that the J and the E sources reflect the period where Judah and Israel were 2 separate countries, then those 2 countries split after the death of Solomon, which is roughly 922 BC. And they remained 2 separate countries until Israel was wiped off the map by the Assyrians in 722 BC. So in that 200-year window between 922 and 722 BCE, E definitely had to be written in there. And J probably, though J could also have been written just before it during the reign of Solomon. And it just favors Judah because it's written down there. But it's somewhere in there. Late 900s BCE is J. no later than 840 BCE, and the E source somewhere between 922 and 722 BCE. So those two are from that period. Then I've argued that the two were put together, the J and the E, into RJE. And if you read the priestly source, it's being written, you can watch it deliberately as an alternative version to this combined JE text. The author of P had JE on the table, and he'd keep writing his own versions of the stories, and he'd change things that mattered to him. So when would that be? That would be when the priestly people, these Aaronid priests, are in power, and the other text, the JE text, is around. And that would be in the reign of King Hezekiah, who's the king after the Assyrians destroyed the king of Israel, the kingdom of Israel. So somewhere between 722 and 700 BCE is when the priestly text is written, I argue. So those are the easy ones. The hard one is the book of Deuteronomy, which is a different source altogether. So in the short version, we just say, okay, D, Deuteronomy's D. But the fact is Deuteronomy is made up of different sections from different periods. Some of it is even older than J and E, I think. And some of it goes all the way down to the very latest times to 500 something BC. So because it's a collected work, the person who put most of it together, we think, was in 622 BC. I don't know why all the 22s keep coming up, but they do. But that's the reign of King Josiah. And I trace it to that period. It's written with remarkable similarities and overlaps, sometimes word for word, with the book of Jeremiah. And Jeremiah is, the main prophet during the reign of Josiah. And so it's somehow connected with him. The first version of the book, Who Wrote the Bible, I argued that it was Jeremiah who wrote much of the book of Deuteronomy. I absolutely took that back in later sections, and people still attribute that to me. So, folks, I was wrong. I take it back. It's not Jeremiah, but it's related in some way to Jeremiah. That's two I was wrongs you got on your program. This may go down in history.
When were these sources compiled together to form the Torah?
Well, in the 5th century BCE, when Jews have returned from the various lands they were dispersed in during all their defeats, and they're living back and they're rebuilding their land of Judah, and they're rebuilding their capital in Jerusalem, and they're rebuilding their temple, this man Ezra shows up from Babylonia. And this is all recounted in the book of Ezra, and it's also recounted in the book of Nehemiah, which is from the same period. And it says that Ezra gathers all the people, and actually says at the water gate, so you can imagine the jokes we've had all these years. He gathers the people at the water gate at Jerusalem, and he has the Levites read to them what it says is the Torah of Moses. And you can tell from the description of what was read that day and what they heard, there are things from J and D and P and D. They got the whole thing. So I think that the Torah that people heard that day, around 450 BCE or so, was the same thing that you and I would read today, with obviously the variations that happen from copying and scribes over time. But essentially, they had the whole Torah done by then. If that's so, and you look at who's the editor who put it all together, the final redactor, and there's all this evidence from the things he favored and what he wrote, that he's a priest, and he's a priest for these Aaronite priests. And so he's a scribe, he's a priest, he knows a lot about the Torah, and he has the power to read this publicly and make everybody accept it. That's Ezra. I mean, he does fit. I mean, if it looks like an Ezra and smells like an Ezra and sounds like an Ezra, then it's an Ezra. So I've argued that Ezra, chances are, is the man who did it. If it wasn't Ezra, then it was his next door neighbor who felt the same way. It's like when people say Shakespeare wasn't by Shakespeare, it was by another man named Shakespeare. I mean, it's in the end, Ezra is our most likely candidate. And if not him, then somebody very much like him from that exact period.
So if it was Ezra that compiled the Torah, which one can look at it that way from reading from what it says, that Ezra did bring out a Torah when the Babylonian captivity, some point after the Babylonian captivity ended. Would he have been influenced at all by the Persian religion, and could he have incorporated Persian ideas when he was assuming he is the guy that assembled the JEPD sources together? Could he have put his own spin from what he knew of the Persian religion?
I can only tell you that I don't see it. I mean, when you look at the latter part of Isaiah, who apparently was someone living in the Persian Empire, in Persia, and the Zoroastrian religion was high then. You can see passages in the second Isaiah that sound a lot like the distinction of light and darkness and good and bad that you would associate with Zoroastrianism. So some people, I'm not quite an expert in that, but some people connect Isaiah with the Persian religion of that time. But I don't see one word of the Torah that does that. So I just don't see that influence. And I'm sure that Ezra, even if he felt like doing that, and even if he said, "Oh God, I sure love these Zoroastrians, I love the Persians, let's get some of that into our books." I mean, even if he wanted to do a dumb thing like that, he had no reason to. He had his sources, J and E and P and D. They were written already, and he didn't write them. He edited them. So at most, he would have gotten to throw in, a reference to Ahura Mazda here and there, but he didn't do that.
Do we know who wrote any of these texts, J, E, D, and P, or are they anonymous?
Well, the simple, correct answer is yes, they're anonymous. For whatever reasons, people in those days didn't usually put their names on their books. It's not true of the prophetic books. The 15 books of the prophets, many of them say, these are the words of, and so it means either that person wrote it, somebody heard him say it, wrote it down. So in those books, it tells. But in the 5 books of Moses, the authors are not identified. There are other books in the ancient Near East too that don't identify the authors. Some do, most don't. Today, it would be unheard of, for an author not to want to get his name on a book, and so that the review has his name in the New York Times and all that. Our egos are different, but they didn't have that like that. For them, they were writing the story and putting it out for people to read. I'm not sure they needed everybody to say, "Oh yeah, and that was George who wrote that." That's how we know that. They didn't try for it. So when I say I think Jeremiah was associated with a scribe named Baruch, and that man Baruch probably did write a lot of the Deuteronomic material. And so, okay, there's one author where you can actually say a name. And but J and E and the priestly source, no. But if I'm giving you Baruch and I'm giving you Ezra, that's 2. That's about as far as we can go, as far as I see. I've heard everybody has their nutty theories about, well, it was this one and it was that one, and I've argued that it could have been a woman who wrote J. So now I start to say, oh well, we have to say what woman it was. So Bathsheba wrote J, and they're just, to me, that's just silliness. You really need evidence to get as specific as that.
And can you tell us a little bit about the additions and subtractions in P and JE? And my second question to that is Deuteronomy connected at all with the court of King Josiah? Because some think that Hilkiah is the one that produced Deuteronomy?
Well, I've said that a portion of it, a key part, was done in the time of Josiah, and I was trying not to get too specific, but here specifically, there's a law code in the middle of Deuteronomy. The Deuteronomic law code goes from chapter 12 to chapter 26. That law code shows all kinds of signs of being very early. It could even be earlier than the kings of Israel. It could be from the time of the judges. And so that's the law code in the middle. But there's an introduction in chapters 1 through 11 to that law code. And there's like an epilogue in chapters 29 and 30 to that law code. Those parts were written by somebody, the evidence is, yes, from the time of Josiah, around 622 BCE. And it could be this man Baruch himself, yes. I used to think it could be Jeremiah himself. I very much doubt that. When Jeremiah writes, he writes in poetry, and this is all in prose. And I understand a person can be a great poet and also a great prose writer, but it's rare to have both, especially at the beginning of time when these are the first prose writers, prose writers who ever lived. So I do trace that part, though, that it was produced at the time in the court of King Josiah. But the history is that King Josiah died very young, and he was just 40 or 39 or something, and he died. And after that, the whole kingdom fell apart. 3 of his sons and 1 of his grandsons got to be king after him. It was like playing musical thrones because they all getting killed, removed, imprisoned by other powers, and so then the Babylonians came and destroyed Judah, and so that's why I think somebody after the Babylonian destruction added a few things, because if you're writing it during the time of King Josiah, say, isn't this great? Josiah's the king. We're winning and we're building a great kingdom here. Life is great. The future is good. Oh, he got killed. So then somebody put on an ending that took into account the disasters that could happen. And so for scholarly reasons, we call those DTR1 is the original version, DTR2 is the fixed version after he died. And people have argued about who the 2 authors are, DTR1 and DTR2. I think they're by the same guy. It's as I've got more than one. I've got 3 different editions of who wrote the Bible. They're all by me. And so these 2, DTR1 and DTR2, are about 35 years apart. People have been known to live that long. I have, and so they could all be, somebody upgraded his work. So yeah, the court of King Josiah, I would say, is crucial. That's like the turning point. But the middle chapters are all written much earlier, and some of these other parts are written much later. It's if ever the term work in progress, applied, it's to Deuteronomy.
So my closing question, what do you think caused this literary tradition to begin? Why did they just suddenly start deciding to write all this stuff, the Torah? Why did they start writing about Moses?
Okay. When I ask my students, which did people write first, prose or poetry? Some of them get the answer right, and some don't. You can go out and ask everybody you know, which did humans write first, prose or poetry? And I don't know what you'd think, but the answer is poetry. Humans not only wrote poetry long before we wrote prose, we wrote poetry for a couple thousand years before we wrote anything in prose. The oldest thing in the world that we know, everything in prose, is the J source of the Torah. So already like 900 something BCE, and nobody on earth has written prose. This is before the Greeks. This is before anybody, except I'm told there may have been prose writing parts of the Gita in India. But as far as any prose that anybody widely knows and has been influenced by, like the Bible, the oldest prose that we know of is J. and remember, so this is like the first historian. If you think that this is history writing, then this person is the first historian. If you think it's all fiction and the person's making up, okay, then this person is the first novelist. But whatever this person is, it's the first one of those. And then the E text the same and the P text the same. For some reason, prose caught on in ancient Israel. I suppose it's because they had such a deep sense of history. And for them, they were the first ones with the instinct to write history, because history is written in prose. Prophecy is written in poetry. There's a reason why all of the prophets write in poetry. And it could be because poetry is not locked in time the same way prose is. The poet is more likely to predict the future than a prose writer. We could have a really interesting theoretical, intellectual discussion about that. But the bottom line is that these people did the first history writing, and they did it in prose. And it didn't happen again then until, Herodotus and Hecataeus and Greeks. But that's later. When you take college history courses and they tell you that Herodotus is the father of history, well, excuse me, the J text and the court history of David were written when Herodotus's great-grandmother wasn't in preschool yet. This was the first history writing, the first prose writing on Earth. And for some reason, they had an instinct to do it. Now, did I answer your question? No. I mean, really, the bottom line then is, but we don't know why they did it. But for some reason, it occurred to them to write something prose, not in poetry. The reason might turn out to be that the first great writer of all of this, the author of J, had a lousy voice and couldn't sing and do poetry. And so thought of writing in prose like just telling it instead of singing it. That could be. It could be some mundane reason like that. But my great teacher, Frank Moore Cross, used to say the most banal reason is usually the correct one.
I want to remind the audience to get his books, Who Wrote the Bible and The Exodus, How It Happened and Why It Matters. I have the Amazon affiliate links to both of his books in the description below, the History Valley Amazon affiliate links. With that being said, thank you for joining me today, Richard Elliott Friedman.
Thank you. Really, it's been great.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron. And or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.